She ran the last quarter-mile to the forge with her brother's shout still ringing behind her and her cheek already swelling where his hand had caught her. And she did not stop running until the heat of the furnace hit her face like a wall, and she stood gasping in the doorway of Amos Riker's smithy with nowhere else in the world left to go. He looked up from the anvil, hammer stilled mid-swing, and took in the sight of her at once, the split lip, the reddened cheek, the way her hands shook where she gripped the doorframe, and he set the hammer down without a word, without the fuss or the questions another man might have made, and simply waited for her to find her breath. Clara Doyle had known Amos Riker 2 years, in the way a town the size of Forge Hollow allowed a woman to know its blacksmith. By the ring of his hammer at dawn, by the shy nod he gave her at the mercantile, by the reputation he carried as a man who said perhaps 40 words in an ordinary week and meant every one of them. She had never once heard him raise his voice. She remembered, too, a winter 3 years back when old Widow Farley's roof had caved under snow, and Amos had rebuilt it in 2 days without being asked, and without ever once mentioning it afterward, so that Clara had learned of it only through the widow's own grateful telling. That, more than anything, was why her feet had carried her here instead of anywhere else, when Silas had come home from the saloon in one of his black moods and gone looking for someone to blame for a debt of his own making. Her father was 5 years in his grave and her mother 2 years behind him, and since then there had been no one standing between Clara and her brother's temper but her own quick feet and the thinness of the walls between their rooms, and she had learned to read the weather of his moods the way a sailor read the sky, and to run before the storm broke whenever she could manage it. "He'll come after me," she said, when she could speak again. "He always does, once his temper's cooled enough to remember he still needs someone to keep his house and take his blows besides. I haven't got anywhere to go, Mr. Riker, and I haven't got any money, and I know it isn't fair to ask it of a man I've barely spoken 20 words to in 2 years, but I am asking it anyway, because I am out of anywhere else to turn." Amos waited, patient as stone, until he was certain she meant to finish. "Marry me," Clara said. "I'll keep your house honest and I'll work hard and I will never once complain of it, and in exchange I only ask that you let me be a wife the law can't take back out of your home again. I know it's a strange bargain to offer a man. I know I've got nothing to bring to it, but I would rather offer you a strange bargain than go back to that house tonight." He was quiet long enough that she felt the flush of her own boldness rising hot in her face, certain she had misjudged him, certain he would send her gently but firmly back out into the evening to find some other solution to a problem that was, after all, not his to solve. Instead, Amos Riker set down the tongs he still held, wiped his blackened hands on his leather apron, and said the only 4 words he needed to answer her with. "I'll fetch the preacher." He did not touch her, did not close the distance between them, only turned toward the door as though the matter were already settled and there was nothing left to do but see it done properly. And Clara stood in the ringing heat of his forge and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something like safety. The wedding was small and plain and held that same evening in the parlor of Reverend Otis Cray, who asked no questions Clara was grateful he didn't ask. And by full dark she was standing in the single spare room behind Amos Riker's smithy, with a ring on her finger that he had made himself from a scrap of silver wire, while the preacher recited the vows, and a husband who had not yet said above a dozen words to her total, and who showed no sign of expecting anything from her that night beyond rest. "You'll sleep here," he said, nodding to the narrow cot along the far wall. "I've slept in the smithy plenty of nights when a job ran late. Won't trouble me none." "Mr. Riker." "Amos," he said, quiet but firm, the first correction he'd offered her all night. "Amos, you've married a woman you scarcely know to spare her a beating. You don't owe me your bed as well as your name." Something moved behind his eyes then, not quite a smile, but close kin to one. "Didn't marry you to spare you one night, Clara. Married you so there needn't be any more of them. Reckon a man ought to be patient about the rest, and let a wife find her own comfort with him in her own time. instead of demanding it the same day he offers his name. It was, she would think later, the longest speech she had ever heard him give, and it settled something in her chest she had not known was still unsettled. She lay awake a long while that first night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that was not her brother's, the settling of the smithy's timbers as they cooled, the distant call of a night bird, the soft, even breathing of a husband she had known only in passing until that very evening, and found, to her own surprise, that she was not afraid. She had spent so many nights lying rigid in her own bed, straining to hear Silas's footsteps on the stair and gauge by their weight and rhythm whether the night would pass quiet or not, that the simple absence of that dread felt almost like a held breath finally let go. Whatever else this strange marriage proved to be, she thought, drifting at last toward sleep, it had already given her that. In the days that followed, Clara set herself to learning her new husband's house and his habits both, and found him easy to keep for, undemanding in the particulars, though she noticed he watched her sometimes across the supper table with a considering look she couldn't quite read, as though he were turning some private thought over the way he might turn a piece of iron before deciding how best to shape it. Amos rose before dawn most mornings out of long habit, and it was in that gray, quiet hour, alone at his anvil before the town woke around him, that he did his clearest thinking, and in the week following his marriage, his thoughts kept circling back, stubborn as a horseshoe on the anvil, to the woman sleeping 20 feet away in his spare room. He had not married for love. He had married because a woman had stood in his doorway bleeding from her own brother's hand, and asked him for the one thing he had it in his power to give freely, his name, his roof, his protection, and he had not been able to imagine any answer but yes. But he found, hammering out nail after nail in the cool blue hour before sunrise, that he wanted now to be the kind of husband worth the desperate bargain she'd struck, not merely a shelter she had run to, a home she might choose to stay in, given time and given choice enough to make that choosing real. He thought, too, of small things he had noticed about her in those first days that most men might have missed entirely. The way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, at sudden movement near her face, though she covered it quick as it came. The careful, grateful way she thanked him for the smallest courtesies, as though kindness were a rare coin she'd learned not to expect twice from the same hand. The pride she took, fierce and quiet, in keeping his house well despite owning almost nothing of her own to bring to it. A woman like that, he thought, turning his hammer over in the gray dawn light, deserved more than a room she had only run to in desperation. She deserved walls she had reason to call her own. So he began, quietly, the way he did everything, to build. He did not tell her his plan. He simply began collecting lumber after his regular work was done, milled planks and sound beams bought with the coin he'd saved against some unnamed future need, and he worked the framing up on a corner of his own land, past the smithy in the hour before supper and the hour after, alone, in the long gold evenings, raising joist by joist and wall by wall a house that was not the spare room behind a forge, a house with 2 proper bedrooms and a real hearth and windows that would catch the morning sun. Clara noticed, of course. She was not a woman who missed what was plainly in front of her. She noticed the sawdust on his boots, the new calluses forming alongside the old ones, the way he vanished for an hour most evenings and came back smelling of cut pine instead of coal smoke. She did not ask him outright what he was building, sensing somehow that whatever it was, he meant it as a kind of answer he wasn't yet ready to speak aloud, and in the meantime she kept his house and mended his shirts and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she had begun to look forward to the sound of his boots on the step at day's end. "You're building something," she said finally, one evening in her 3rd week as his wife, unable to hold the question back any longer. "Past the smithy, I've seen the timber." Amos looked up from the stew she'd set before him and for once did not immediately look back down. "A house," he admitted. "For you, proper one, not just a room behind a forge a woman never chose for herself." He hesitated, turning his spoon slowly. "Thought if you were going to be my wife in truth, you ought to have a home you'd have picked out yourself, given the choosing. I can't give you back the choosing you didn't have when you came to me. Reckoned I could at least give you a house worth staying in." Clara found she could not immediately answer him, her throat gone tight and warm, and when she did speak her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. Amos Riker, that is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me, and you have been doing it in secret for 3 weeks without a word. Didn't want you thanking me before it was finished, he said. Man likes to give a whole gift, not a half one. It was Silas who found them first, on a Sunday evening 6 weeks into the marriage, striding up from the road with the particular loose, dangerous gait Clara knew meant whiskey and grievance both, shouting for his sister to come out and account for herself, for the shame she'd brought him marrying without his leave, for the debt her leaving had left him to answer for alone. Amos was in the yard framing the last of the roof when Silas came on, and he set down his hammer and stepped, unhurried, between the advancing man and the house. "She's my wife," Amos said, and his voice, so rarely raised, carried clear and level across the yard. "Whatever's between you and her is done being your business the day she said her vows to me. You've got no claim here, Doyle, and you'll turn around and walk back down that road, or I'll see the sheriff hears exactly what marks are on her face that match the ones you left the night she ran to me." Silas came on anyway, fists already curling, too deep in his temper to hear reason offered quiet. "You've no right keeping her from me," he shouted, swaying where he stood. "She's my blood, not yours, and I'll say what's owed her and what ain't." "She's my wife," Amos said again, no louder than before, but there was iron in it now that hadn't been there a moment past. "That makes her no man's business to strike but her own choosing, and she's chosen me. You'll not raise a hand to her while I've breath to stand between you." It was Clara, then, not hiding behind the wall of her husband as Silas no doubt expected, but stepping out beside him, chin lifted, refusing one more time in her life to be a woman who only cowered while men decided her fate around her, who spoke the words that finally stopped him cold. "I've already told the Reverend everything, Silas, and the sheriff's wife besides, who is not a woman known for keeping quiet counsel. You lay one hand on either of us tonight, and there won't be a soul left in this county who doesn't know exactly what kind of man you are. I am done being afraid of you. I have a husband and a home now, and neither one of them is yours to touch." Silas stood swaying a moment in the dusk, some last calculation working behind his reddened eyes, and whatever he found there, the sheriff's name, the Reverend's, the sight of Amos Riker's broad, immovable stillness, or perhaps simply his sister's own unbending voice, steadier than he had ever heard, it was enough, finally, to turn him. He spat once in the dirt, muttered something no one troubled to make out, and walked back down the road the way he'd come, and did not come again. Clara stood shaking faintly in the aftermath, and Amos turned to her at once, his hard stillness gone soft with concern. "He hurt you." "No," she said, "not tonight, not ever again, I think." She looked past him to the half-finished house rising gold in the last of the light, the roof beams bare against the sky, and felt something settle in her that she suspected would take a lifetime to fully name. "Amos, thank you for standing between us." "Reckon that's what a husband's for," he said simply. "Standing between his wife and whatever means her harm. Ought to have said as much the day you asked me, 'stead of just fetching the preacher and letting you wonder if I meant it." "You didn't need to say it," Clara told him. "I've watched you build it, one board at a time, for 6 weeks." He finished the house before the first snow, and on the evening he carried her over its new threshold, not because tradition demanded it, but because he said, with the particular quiet gravity that was entirely his own, that he wanted the first thing that house ever held to be her, carried in his own 2 arms, chosen and choosing both. Clara Doyle Riker looked around at the hearth he'd laid with his own hands, the windows he'd set to catch the morning sun, and understood that she had not merely escaped her brother's fists that first frightened evening at the forge. She had found in the silent blacksmith who answered a desperate proposal with nothing but steady, patient devotion, the first home she had ever truly chosen, and the first man who had ever let her choose it freely at her own unhurried pace, for as long as she needed to be sure. "I love you," she told him that night, the words coming easier than she'd expected once she'd found the courage to begin them. "I didn't when I asked you to marry me. I do now." Amos Riker, a man who had said perhaps 40 words in an ordinary week for as long as Forge Hollow had known him, drew his wife close inside the walls he'd built her and found, for once, that he had exactly the right words ready and did not hesitate over a single one of them. "Been loving you since the night you asked," he said. "Just took me building you a house to work up the nerve to say it plain."